Hi there, my name's Mrs. Edwards and I am the reading leader at school. My role as part of the curriculum evening is to share with you the changes that we've made over the last few years about reading in school and how we teach reading, and how it works as a whole school a plan rather than specifically to your year groups. If you haven't already watched the video that Mr. Eardley did, then I suggest you watch that first and then you come back to this one because they follow on quite neatly, I think. So since we last were able to talk to you in the capacity of a curriculum evening, we have made huge changes in school with the way that we teach reading. That's partly come about because lockdown gave us the opportunity to pursue some theory and some research that perhaps we wouldn't have had a chance to do at the same time as being in a class full time with children. So in some ways, we got something beneficial out of that. What we were then able to do was bring some of that research back into school, having worked out what would be a good approach for Wistow. We have Wistowed it, so we've made it suit our needs and our children, and we have developed it over the last year or 18 months. It's not a finished project, it's a project that's ongoing. We already have targets for things that we want to do this year, and I already have a list of extra things that are not on the targets that we want to add as well. So it's an ongoing project, and the more we learn about the way children read, the more it will be adapted, I suppose, and the more we really are able to see how our children are working with it, the more we'll be able to make sure it matches their needs exactly. We're really pleased with the work that's happened so far. I'm going to go through with you a little bit about what has happened, and then to talk about the structure of reading in school so that you are able to understand what your children might be sharing with you if they come home and talk about it. So we did a variety of training on reading in June 2020, September again 2020, and May 2021. We've given over a lot of our staff training time to developing reading, with a particular focus on developing whole class reading. And I'm going to talk in more detail about that in a few minutes. We have removed guided reading, and we have replaced it with whole class reading. Guided reading was where the children read in a little group and their teacher carouselled around, which meant that they may have had perhaps 10 minutes a week with their own teacher reading, but in a small group working during a guided reading session, or they may have had 20 minutes a fortnight if the teacher was rotating with the teaching assistant. This way, all of the children are reading a lot more and the teacher is interacting with all children a lot more, and we've already found that to be hugely beneficial. We rebanded our colour-band books, so if your children are reading colour-band books, then their books are now banded according to which phonics phase they're working on, not just a random selection of books that we think are more challenging as we work through them. And so that was a requirement, a request from the government. So that's something that we've worked on. We've fully introduced accelerated reader and STAR testing. So those children who are in the later part of year 2 and all the way up to year 6 will begin STAR testing, which gives them a number, an accelerated reader number, and then they read books according to their accelerated reader number. It's called a ZPD number. The benefit of that is multiple. There are multiple benefits, sorry. Firstly, we get online data because the testing is done online, so that staff can download a whole host of information about what your children understand, what they don't understand, and what they need to work on, and they can pull that off individually, and they can also pull that off as a whole class or set groups. We're also able to make sure that the children are still progressing through something that isn't the same as colour bands, but it stops that end of colour band kind of vagueness of what the children read, where they then step into the library and select their books. And we all know that some of those books will not be suitable, not just from content, but also from the level of challenge. Just because you're in Key Stage 2 does not mean you are ready to read any book that's in the library. So that's come and done a lot of work for us. There is a long way to go for accelerated reader. We're in the progress of reviewing some of our training and looking at setting targets and setting challenges for the children to work towards, but we're well into that programme. And we also developed a document called What Does Reading at OWPS Look Like? It's part of a selection of documents. There is one From the English team, there is a what does English look like? There is a what does phonics look like? What does reading look like? The new one that's just about to be published on the website is what does the library look like? And they all work together to tell you a little bit more about English and reading. That document's available on the website if you would like to go and look at it, and it talks a little bit more in detail about some of what I'm going to share with you, and some of the research that we did in order to prepare for it. So we went away and did a variety of different types of research. We used social media sources. We looked at what other schools did. We used a variety of academic research and kind of pulled it all together to find a way forward for Wistow. The following things are the things that have changed, and they are things that you will hear your children talking about, or your teachers talking about perhaps during parents' evening. And this, I'm going to go through what each of those things are. So we've changed our timetabling in school for reading. We have developed how we select texts for each of the classes to use in their reading lessons. We are developing the vocabulary and general knowledge that the children need, which will facilitate their reading. We've developed a concept of just reading, something called close reading and text marking. We've developed the use of text-dependent questions and the idea of performance tasks. Now, that sounds like a lot. It was a lot. The children have taken to it beautifully, and I'm hoping to kind of give you a whistle-stop tour of what each of those things look like in school now. So we developed an approach to reading where there are 5 sessions. Now, this is the aspiration, and this is what's embedded pretty much from the beginning of Key Stage 2 all the way to the end of Key Stage 2. Foundation stage take elements of this and they timetable it in a way that suits them. Key Stage 1 slide during the year and transition into what suits them, but they focus specifically in year 1 particularly on sessions 1, 2 and 3, and then over time they develop the other areas as and when they need to. So we have a planned reading session in school every day for these sessions. So for whole class reading, foundation stage bulk theirs together and timetable it slightly differently, but they have the same content and the same concept. The sessions are aimed to be 30 minutes. So in a class from year 3 to year 6, you would expect to see 5 30-minute reading sessions. Those are on top of children having their own opportunity to independently read, quietly read. There may be a class text that the teacher is reading as well. There may be a text that they're reading for their English lessons. Those are all separate. So from that, you can see that we have prioritised reading and the amount of time that we timetable for reading. And the reason we've done that is because we know how important it is. Ultimately, if a child doesn't learn to read and doesn't learn to read well, then they're going to struggle with every other area of the curriculum. And whilst we've known that for a long time, it's been difficult to balance timetabling and justify what we're doing. There is a move amongst every element of education, both kind of political, which is helpful in some ways, and theoretical, in making sure that the reading content in our school day is prioritised. The children in Key Stage 1 and Foundation Stage also have phonics sessions. That's on top of their whole class reading. And we're looking at developing our phonics delivery across Key Stage 2 this year as well. And the children also have a visit to the library so that they can change their books. But that session is not entirely designed around changing books. It is designed around developing a love of reading and around making sure that children understand how a library works and what's the point of it, etc. So we have these 5 sessions. We have a session where we introduce vocabulary and general knowledge, a session where we just read, a close reading session, performance task sessions, and then we have what's called a consolidation time or reading for pleasure. And I'll talk about each of those as we go. So before we start with our reading each half term, we make decisions about what texts we're going to use. We are developing a document which shows which texts we use and why. But there are lots of reasons why we choose texts. And what we're trying very much to do is pull away from always using the same text because we've always used them, and always using the same text that a teacher particularly likes. What we need to do is make sure that we have a balance of texts across school, so that the children access a wide variety of texts by the time they leave us. We need to make sure that the texts are engaging and that this particular cohort will respond to them. It may be that a text that suited last year's year 6 doesn't suit this year's year 6, and that's an open and flowing decision to be made by those teachers as they work through the year. It needs to be sufficiently challenging. So the slightly odd thing from a planning point of view, I suppose, and perhaps from a teacher point of view when we first started doing it, is that whole class reading means that you are not reading a text which is aimed at everybody's ability. There will be a number of children in your class who are struggling with reading that text themselves. However, for the majority of the time, the text is being read to them. So this is less about their decoding skills and more about them understanding text. That's the focus for us, and that's what we're trying to develop. What we found is that leaving them in a guided reading group where they only ever read a text which is their ability level means that they're not going to progress with their understanding and their comprehension. And actually, children tend to make more rapid progress in their reading when they enjoy reading. If you give them easier books, especially as they get older, they tend to disengage from them because they see them as babyish and they're not appealing. So they need to be sufficiently challenging for everybody in the class. We need to make sure it's the right sort of level. We use our information that we've got about colour banding and accelerated reader to help us a bit along the way. And also we support the concept that the children need to access something called the 5 plagues of the developing reader. So this is part of the research that I did before we rolled out this project. And the 5 plagues of the developing reader are about the fact that eventually when children leave us, they're going to go on to be an independent reader of all sorts of texts. So this is less about preparing them for the text in their year group and more about preparing them for the type of text that they will come across as an adult. Okay, so the 5 plagues are, now the children won't necessarily be aware of them, but I do think it's interesting to share with you. I'm not going to go into them in detail. So archaic texts. You'll remember perhaps from being at school yourselves that there are some books that we can pick up and the language can be quite challenging, often because it's an older text. So the language in an archaic text can be challenging because the structure is different, because the vocabulary is different. And what we want to do is make sure that as our children go to secondary school or onto university, or just want to read for pleasure as they're older, they're not restricted by these different challenging texts because they are more confident about the fact that they can find out what those words mean and they have a better understanding that it will be read in a slightly different way or structured in a different way. So one challenge is an archaic text, an older text. One challenge is something called a non-linear time sequence. So the idea that a story can jump about. So you might jump from forwards and backwards, you might jump from a different place in time. Actually, this is a really good example of children watching films and not understanding what's going on because they haven't recognised that the characters have become younger or older. And actually, that's something that we want them to learn from a life skill for reading, but actually any kind of story that you are immersed in, be it film, TV, or books, can have that kind of structure. So sometimes we have something called the complexity of the narrator. So we might have, so for example, Wonder is a text that Year 6 used last year, and Wonder is written with various different voices. So each chapter has a different narrator. So sometimes it's Oggy, the main character, sometimes it's his sister, sometimes it's somebody else. So that causes the children some confusion because they have to work out who it is speaking and why that changes the impact of what you're reading. Lemony Snicket's a really good example. Lemony Snicket actually tells the story himself. However, he describes every event in the book as being true, even though as an adult we know, listening to that, and probably most children, that it can't possibly be true because they're highly unlikely. So that's a really confusing voice to listen to as the narrator. So the children have to kind of stand back and pick that apart if they're going to enjoy it. So there's also the complexity of the story. Sometimes we might come across symbolism and a complex plot. We might have multiple plots running alongside each other. Midsummer Night's Dream is a good example of that, where you've got the story of the theatre, I've forgotten the word, the performers, were the actors putting their play together, and that goes inside the other play, so that's confusing. And some texts are what we call a resistant text. So resistant text was usually written by an author or a poet because they want it to be difficult to understand. The whole point of it is that it's not supposed to make sense, or it's supposed to be so challenging that it kind of stretches you and taxes you. The Jabberwocky is a good example. The Ning Nang Nong is a really good poem that's a good example of that, by Spike Milligan. And then we talk about the 5 plagues, but actually, when you start to research the 5 plagues, there's often a discussion about the fact that there should be a 6th plague, and that for some children, that 6th plague can be the non-fiction. So non-fiction can be very challenging for some children because the layout is odd. It's different depending on what type of non-fiction it is. It's difficult to decipher whether something is biased or not. And whilst we've taught all of those things to children historically, we maybe haven't analysed the texts in the same way, to the same kind of depth. So when we're picking our texts, we're trying to make sure that the children across school are exposed to all of those. And you'd be surprised actually that right down into Key Stage 1, there are options which cover a lot of those. Now, obviously, we're not going to always cover a text that has those. We're not going to cover a text that's got all of them, but what we're looking to do is across the children's time at Wistow, they will come across a variety of those type of books, so that it's not a completely unfamiliar concept when they come to a book themselves that perhaps has got one of those difficulties, those plagues in. We also consider, when we're picking a text, how old the text is. So that kind of ties in with the archaic concept, but also we're looking constantly at what's out now. So what are the new books that have been written by authors that are being, acclaimed as being fantastic? So we're making sure that our reading is up to date, as well as covering what we might call a classic, a traditional, or an archaic text. We want to make sure that our books are engaging our pupils. We don't want them to be reading something that they find droll or difficult to engage in. We want to read books that the children can see themselves in. So they want to, the main character, the protagonist, needs to be them. So we should be reading texts about children. We should be reading texts about children who look different. We should be reading texts about children who've got difficulties in their lives. We should be reading texts about children who have got a straightforward, easy, happy-go-lucky childhood and no difficulties. So the aim is that we look at a variety of texts that cover all of those areas. We want to make sure that the books we read represent a wide variety of people and communities, both here in our country and abroad. So we're looking at international, not international texts specifically, but texts that are based in other countries. And we also want to make sure that we use a variety of genre. We don't want to always be reading something that's sci-fi, if that's a particular kind of hook for some children. We don't always want to read historical text. We want a breadth. We do want things like fairy tales. We do want to make sure that we are, maybe dabbling with a bit of horror. Year 5 did a fantastic book that was horror based last year and had my spine tingling when I was reading it with them. So we're looking for a variety of texts. So our first session, usually, and if it's not a session built in the same way as in Key Stage 2, then this is something that will become before a read, is to explore vocabulary and general knowledge. If you've watched the video that Mr. Erdley's done, he's spoken to you about the amount of vocabulary you need to know and understand in order to understand the text. And what happens is, if we share challenging text with our children, there will be challenging vocabulary. So we pick apart that vocabulary by doing lessons which are specifically about learning the definition of certain words and how those words work in sentences, for example. We also explore general knowledge before we read a particular part of a text. There may well be, for example, Year 6 read a book that is based in Victorian times and it talks about a workhouse. Before that, the children were exposed to some good examples of first-hand experiences of what a workhouse was like, some imagery, diary entries, those kind of things, so that the children have got a concept about a workhouse before they start to explore it. Now, that's a historical context, but we shouldn't be surprised by children not understanding where a book is set, because it's different to what they're familiar with. And that's not just historical, that could be to do with the location, it could be to do with the culture, it could be to do with the fact that the author's making something up and they're trying to kind of come to grips with where the author's got the idea from and how that's been built. So before we actually do most of our reading, we explore the texts, and the children often record some of that in what's called a reading reflection book. So the older children have these green reading reflection books, so when we get to share books with you again around Parents' Evening, you'll see these kind of reading journals, and it shows the journey that the children make through the text that they're reading. The younger children contribute to a class reading book, where they might answer something on a post-it note, or there might be examples of the children's work that are gathered together. But some of the vocabulary and general knowledge work takes place in there. It's not all written, sometimes it is just verbal. Then we have a Just Read session, and the Just Read session is a protected reading session. They are children, the idea is that it's an opportunity for adults to read to children. The children are not supposed to be asked any questions. We shouldn't be analysing it. We should just be reading it, just listening and enjoying. Teachers have this amazing talent for stopping every sentence or two to pick apart, to ask questions, to understand. And whilst that's all very valuable and very important, it doesn't help with engagement and enjoyment, because the children miss the flow of a text. And so we've prioritised the Just Read. Some classes just read a class text as well, so that's the kind of going home books, the books that they're reading at the end of the day, that they're just pursuing for enjoyment. And the idea is that the children are engaged in that. Now, the aim is that we would then go back and reread certain sections again, and we would start picking those apart, and we would pick those apart in our close reading sessions. So the little image on the side there says close reading. Number 1, what the text says. Number 2, how the text says it. Number 3, what the text means. And it's basically the analysis, the deep analysis of a text. So it says on my slide, I've got a quote from Doug Lemov. Now, a lot of the work that I did around my research has come from Doug Lemov. Very well thought of educational theorist, also doing lots of work which we're using for some of our teaching strategies as well, which is great. But one of the end goals of teaching is to instill in students the ability to wrestle with the most demanding texts, interpreting them independently, and understand why and how they mean what they do. Close reading does this, and that makes it critically important. So the whole point of a close reading session is that we are getting children to really deeply understand a piece of text. That lesson may only focus on a sentence. It may focus on a paragraph. It may focus on a piece of dialogue. It will be a small section of what's been read to them previously, and that section will be read multiple times together as a group, perhaps taking it in turns, the teacher reading it. And the aim is that we give children the opportunity to explore a text that they may initially read and think, goodness me, this is challenging, I don't understand what on earth it's talking about, and actually finding that they've got a good understanding when they can stand back and pick it apart. Now, if a text is needing to be picked apart all day, every day, then it's too challenging for the child to read alone. But the aim is to give them the skills, the tools, so that as they become older, they are able to go and pick apart a text and understand the voice, for example, understand why it's punctuated the way it is, understand why it's structured the way it is. So those sessions are extremely important. And part of that reading session, I'm going to skip past that one. Part of that reading session might include text marking, where the children would annotate on a text, their own little copy of the text, what's happening, how the author is telling us, how do we know that the character is angry? Well, the author doesn't write so-and-so is angry. They get the character to stomp through the room, smash something, kick something, growl at somebody. What is it that the author's done that's made the audience know that the character is angry? We might look at the text structure. That's particularly good for non-fiction. But actually, how is a text structured and what's the author trying to do with that? We might look for points of view in a text. What's the author intent? If the children talk to you about authorial intent, that's the same thing. And use of punctuation. How does putting an exclamation mark on the end of that sentence change its meaning? What would happen if we changed it to a full stop? Can we change it to a question mark? Would that change the meaning again? So again, we're picking apart why something is structured the way it is, and we're going very, very deep into the nitty-gritty. And one of the ways we do that is by using something called text-dependent questions. And the concept of it is that we are using a microscope to look at a text. So text-dependent question, those which cannot be answered without firm knowledge of the text itself. They cannot be faked by carefully listening to discussion, for example, or by conducting an earnest but inexact reading of the chapter. We don't want the children to merely gain the gist of the text. We want them to understand it and be able to explain how the author told them the gist. So you might have a child who, having listened to the teacher read it expressively, can say, the teacher says to the children, how does the character feel? The character feels angry. That's the gist. Why do you know? How do you know that the character feels angry? I know that the character feels angry because he stomped into the room and kicked a door. He growled at the child when she asked him a question. So it's what we don't want is children, particularly when we're in a whole class reading session where we've got mixed ability, some children accessing text more easily than others. We don't want anybody sitting and getting the gist of what's going on. What do we think is going on? That's easy. The text-dependent question means that you have to be able to know the text and understand the text to answer it. We've done a lot of work on this, and we've had to go back to work on it again to make sure that the questions we're asking are very specific so that we can get to the nitty-gritty of the text. So a good example, so the teacher would say, what is Shakespeare saying about love in this particular sonnet? I'm giving you the example, we don't need it. And the student says, love doesn't last. And the teacher asks, can anyone develop it? So they're picking it apart. The student says, yes, it's like a flower, it blooms and then it's fade. Yes, love to Shakespeare is fleeting like a flower. So they're asking for that evidence from the text. You will have heard your children talking about that probably before. You may have heard the teacher talk about that before when they're answering questions, making sure that they give their evidence from the text. And that's all part of us making sure that the questions dig deep enough for the children to have a good understanding of what they're reading. And then finally on my slides, we then go on to performance tasks. So performance tasks effectively in the olden days would have been a set of comprehension questions. So we would have given the children a cold text, a text they hadn't read, a set of comprehension questions, and we would have asked them to read it and answer the questions. As we've got a better understanding of reading, actually we've clarified that that's just testing the children's reading repeatedly. So comprehension questions, unless you have taught the children about the content of the text before asking them the questions, is actually testing them, not teaching them. So what we do in our performance task sessions is we give something like a comprehension question, but it would be deeper and more complex. It might ask the children to create an image or a picture which shows you what they know about the character. It might ask their children to think about the relationships between different characters. It might be a set of comprehension questions, but they would be specifically linked to what had been taught in the previous lessons. So the children are not being asked to come up with their own answers. Effectively, they've been taught the answers before they start. And then what they've got to do is put that together to answer the questions. And then they record those pieces of information on their performance task in those reading journals again. They put the close reading in the reading journal as well. And then you end up with a kind of performance task. So when we say performance task, it's not a stand up and do drama. It is a performing, showing what you know. If you've got a child who's not able to access the performance task after the first 3 days of input, then you know that there's an issue with the child either listening or understanding, and so that's something that the teacher needs to do to dig that apart. There is a bit of flexibility, and as I said, Friday can be a continuation of performance tasks, it can be a consolidation of something that's gone before the week, it can just be reading ahead. It can just be reading for pleasure. Lots of the texts we're looking at are long and chunky and detailed, and actually having the opportunity to just sit and read for a bit longer can be beneficial to make sure that you're using a good text and not ignoring it because it's too long and we're never going to get through it. It's also a good opportunity. We use the sessions for performance tasks and the 5th session for interventions. If children need individual interventions, we can put those in for reading, and to pick up children who've perhaps had difficulty understanding a particular aspect or some general knowledge. So there's a kind of flexibility in the structure for the last day or two of the teaching sessions, but the first few are very rigid, and that's why the whole of school is using those first 3. So we have our vocabulary and general knowledge, our just reading for enjoyment, our close reading, our picking apart of the text, and then we explore what we've learned through our performance tasks. So hopefully that's given you a whistle-stop tour of what the reading looks like in school. The only thing left for me to say really is thank you. Thank you for the reading that you do with your families. I know that the reading diaries can be hard work. I appreciate that as a mum, getting the reading diary out and writing in it. The priority for us is that you are reading with or to your children and your children are reading to you. You cannot underestimate the positive impact you will have on your children's lives by investing in time in reading with them. The idea of the dojos and us writing in the diary is that we're creating an aspiration for the children who need something visual. And so that's why we expect it to be written into those diaries, because that's a part of the agreement that we make with you when you first join us as a school. So I would encourage you to keep reading, get those 5 times a week in, but don't underestimate the value of that snuggly read on the sofa on a Sunday afternoon, or a bedtime read. Go back and read the stories that they liked when they were little. It doesn't have to be what they're reading right now all the time. But the more opportunity you can give to them to read and practice their reading and explore books, I promise you the impact, the long-term impacts are huge, and your children will thank you for it as they are older, just like we thank you for all the effort that you put in. Keep up the hard work. If you've got any questions when you've watched your classes, your year groups own films, then don't hesitate to contact your class teacher, or I'm always around. You can email the office if you've got anything specific that you're interested in or you want to know a bit more about. Take care, and thank you very much for listening.